Welcome to our podcast. This is another recorded episode of Stay Classy San Diego, with video production and studio provided by MaxLux Media, sponsored by Dorada Nutrition, with your host being myself, Steve Wire, a freelance reporter. This podcast is dedicated to fostering quality dialogue surrounding all things local policy related in North County, San Diego. Join us weekly as we interview political leaders, analysts, professionals, and community members on issues ranging from homelessness to housing density to elections. So today we bring to the studio a couple people to talk about the issue of gun violence in America. On my left we have Carol Landale, and on my right we have Steve Bartram. This is a topic that I've been wanting to address for a while because it seems like, unfortunately, we don't go a week without hearing about another mass shooting, and it's personal to me as well. So I wanted to bring in a couple of frontline local experts to talk about this issue. And Carol is actually the Vice President of San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention, a coalition of national and local gun violence prevention organizations. She got involved in the movement after retiring from teaching after the Sandy Hook tragedy in 2012. And as for many, this was her tipping point, and she's been working in the GVP world ever since. You taught high school and middle school, is that correct?
Correct.
And then Steve, I'm on my right, he is an active supporter of gun violence prevention. He's also a retired Vietnam-era United States Marine Corps pilot. He was also a retired high school science teacher from North County, San Diego. He is the past coordinator of the GVP program at Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of San Diego, the original creator and sponsor for the San Diego area Sandy Hook Vigils. So I wanted to start off by going kind of current. Most recently, like, we've had a number of shootings in the past few weeks that I think we'd be remiss in not addressing. So just in the last few weeks, a couple of the notable ones have been the Allen, Texas mall shooting, where a man opened fire at the Allen Premium Outlets, killing 8 people and injuring 7 others before he was killed by police. Cleveland, Texas, there was a man with an AR-15 who opened fire at a home, killing 5 people, including a child. I'm not sure what his fate was. I think he was apprehended. But I know that these aren't local incidents, but they are the things that grab our attention. And specifically, there's been a lot of coverage, graphic coverage of these particular shootings. So I want to start with you, Steve.
Okay.
What do these shootings really tell us about where we're at with gun violence on a national level?
It talks to the pandemic kind of level that gun violence really resides at. It is a public health issue. The death of anybody causes that. So that's all of these things require our immediate and full attention. So that's where we're at. It is a crisis that we are frankly not facing up to in the most common sense way that we could. Carol's efforts and all of our efforts to bring this to attention is what we need to do.
Carol, I wanted to ask you this question. So one thing that makes it difficult, as we were talking about before we started airing, is that there are so many of these shootings now that we sort of lose track in terms of commemorating or remembering these tragedies. I'd be the first to say I'm guilty of this. I've already forgotten a lot of the incidents that have happened the past few years. I mean, and you've been around longer than I have. So, I mean, are we kind of approaching a point now where these shootings are so commonplace that we're sort of getting, unfortunately, desensitized to the issue of gun violence? And what do we do about that?
Yeah. So, yeah, I totally agree. We are becoming desensitized, and it's a tragedy. So when I first started in this business of gun violence prevention, we would keep track of the mass shootings. I started right after Sandy Hook, and that was quite tragic enough. And at that time, we were convinced that the national government, federal government, would do something about gun violence. Nothing happened. So now we're in 2023, and we've had more mass shootings this year than we've had days. And a mass shooting is 4 or more people being shot. And so we as an organization no longer keep track. We cannot keep track. These are happening every day. But I think also that we need to look at, okay, the mass shootings are what get the press's attention, and that's what the public knows about, but they are becoming inured to it. But they are already completely inured to the day-to-day shootings that go on. We're looking at 100 plus people every day in this country who are killed with a gun.
Yeah. And I do want to talk about the fact that there's this distinction between gun violence as a whole and mass shootings specifically, and sort of how those two become conflated. Because one thing I'll say, and we'll get into this more later, is that it's a fact that more of the deaths from gun violence actually come from gun suicides than than mass shootings or even gun violence homicides. So that's one point I wanted to make right off the bat. But I wanted to take a step back for a second here. Steve, like sort of the history and timeline of this issue. I mean, a lot of people would say, it seemed like this has become, it's just accelerated really. And does it sort of start with Columbine? Does it sort of start with, the late 90s and sort of, maybe loosening of some gun control laws? Like where does the problem start? And sort of how does it progress to where we are now, where it seems like we are desensitized to, as you said, more mass shootings than we have days?
Gosh, you're asking, as I'm looking at Carol, we're both smiling because we know the deep history of all of these issues and how far back it goes. There are books and books and books and all the history of what's happened. Clearly, what is going on is the proliferation of guns has brought this to our attention. I can point to a specific place in time in which we began to see a rise in gun violence, and that is when the NRA went from an organization that was concerned with safety to an NRA that supported the proliferation of guns, and specifically the proliferation of individual guns and their assault and requirement for all of us. For all of us to own a gun. And so what happens is more guns means more death. And I'll put it frankly as part of the solution is for the gun owners to be able to, not the gun owners, but the people who create guns, to provide us with solutions to how that's going to be a change.
Sure. Carol, you going to add something? Or?
What you said last, Steve, about being the gun industry, the responsibility of the gun industry to make some effort now to change their marketing practices, and also work with politicians on legislation that would be acceptable to gun owners.
Sure. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that the problem accelerated when the NRA and specifically the gun industry and the gun lobby began to promote individual ownership of these high capacity types of weapons. Is that sort of it's like the genesis for this and how we got to where we are now?
I don't want to say just high capacity. There was a transition in the political field, if you will, about what NRA was really all about. And they went from being an organization that was being politically driven by safety to being politically driven by corporate greed and their desire to earn money.
Sure.
And so what we have is, we just have all of that that goes with it. And with that, we have the incorporation of some very smart people, from my view, poorly smart people, who have changed the focus from guns will save you to guns are the reason that we have all these deaths. Mm-hmm. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of information relative to gun deaths. It is, and as I said, and Carol will hear me out, it is the gun. It's the gun.
Do you think that, in terms of the problem getting worse in the past couple of decades, do you think that there's any credibility to this notion that these shootings have sort of a reciprocal effect where, there's you had Columbine, you've had, there was the shooting in West Virginia about 20 years ago, mm-hmm. I can't remember which.
UVA.
At UVA. Do these incidents sort of just inspire each other? Because, it seems like each shooting, every couple of years, we see one that sort of outdoes the rest. So, are we getting to the point now where this thing is just full-blown out of control because you have all the you have sort of the blueprint and the playbook of how to do this, and that's sort of driving more of these events. Is that kind of where we're at now?
I think Carol and I would both agree with you on this. It's like anything else. There's copycats to what happens, and someone says, I can get attention, I can do this, mm-hmm. I can take my anger out, I can take whatever it is that I want to do, and I will I can kill people, and that's the problem.
Go ahead.
Cool.
So just to chime in on that, I think one of the things that has really exacerbated the whole problem of the copycat shootings is the social media. And the other thing, the press is getting better now, but for a long time, the press was highlighting the name of the shooter. And that, in many cases, was exactly what the shooter was going for. And then in social media, if you go back over social media posts that the shooter has put up, they're looking to outdo the last school shooting or the last shooting. So I think we've got two problems going on. Failure of the press to focus on the victims rather than on the shooter, and then the social media that is kind of driving a lot of what copycat shooters are going into.
Now, Carol, I want to talk a little bit about what you do. So, San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention. Tell me a little bit about how you guys got started, what the impetus for this was, and talk about some of the work you've been doing, like some of the recent efforts and particular policy points of emphasis that you're concerned about.
Yeah. So, San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention started in 2018. And what was happening in 2018, Steve and I and a number of others had been going along in San Diego working with Brady, now Brady United Against Gun Violence. And then Moms Demand Action came along, and they had a chapter here, and we found our work we're pretty much doing the same work. So Moms Demand Action and Brady United Against Gun Violence joined forces, and we became San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention. Since that time, we have expanded our coalition to now 17 members, and these are organizational members that are focused on prevention and intervention. They're focused on civic types of organization, and also faith-based, including the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of San Diego, which is a big mouthful.
It is.
So, together, all of these organizations are wanting to do something about the problem, whether it's supporting victims. We have two organizations that work with victims of violence in general and very much gun violence. We have the two organizations who work with gang violence intervention and prevention. And
is that Pastor Sandoval down in
Pastor Sandoval and Bishop Bowser? They each have their individual organizations. And then, so what do we do? What do all of our organizations do? I think was part of your question. So we work with our local and state, in fact, and federal legislators, advocating for the various bills that are in the California State House and at City Council and at county supervisors. And then we also are working as much as we can with our Congress members who, for the most part in San Diego, have the same values as we do, with one exception. But there's very little they can do at the federal level with the current Congress. So we really do try to focus on the local and state legislation.
Do you feel like the organization as it stands right now, like you feel like your goal is more, given the intractability of things at the national level, like do you feel like your goal is more, let's educate, let's inform, let's spread awareness, or is it more like let's fight for policy reform at the state and federal level?
Yeah, the idea with having local legislation and state legislation filter upwards, that's kind of where we are. So, California has been a leader in gun violence prevention legislation that we have in place. So we're hoping that, states like California can be the model for other states, and eventually, and it's a long way off, at the federal level.
Sure.
Can I just add to what Carol was saying? I want to give Carol a great deal of credit for the initiation of this thing, and we go way back. But the thing that's really happened is, I remember meeting over coffee with just a half a dozen people, and now We have 500-600 actually.
We have on our mailing list, we have 1,500 people on our mailing list. And those are people that get our calls to action, and that might be contacting a legislator. It could just simply be about an event. And we have somewhere around 100 people who are pretty active in doing things like tabling events where we provide information at events, educate the public on what they can do, and very specifically on gun violence restraining orders and domestic violence, because those are two things that a lot of people are not aware of, and they're not aware of the tools that are available to them.
Sure.
I think the thing that's just important about what Carol's work does is that we see the beginning of a pyramid of strength relative to the people who are doing things. There are different groups and committees that do different things. So all of us can contribute in some fall. We can't all do everything, but we can do something.
Sure.
And so that's what they're trying to do. And Carol is now beginning to build this pyramid, if you will, of strength to try to get us to, and I've talked a little bit about this tipping point, about where can we really get, at what point will we get where we can see some action that will be taken. State and local is good. Federal is a different issue.
Sure.
We need to do that. So I want to thank you for asking us, Colin.
I wanted to get to federal in a minute, but before we do that, at the local and state level, so I mean, California, relative to the rest of the country, is typically considered more in the progressive column when it comes to the issue of gun violence. Now, obviously, there's limitations on what we as a state can even do because of the Second Amendment, which I also want to talk about. But at the state and local level, I mean, AR-15s, weapons like AR-15s are already illegal. I mean, what can we be doing at a state and local level, policy-wise, that we're not doing now to prevent more of these incidents from occurring? Like, where's the next battle to be fought in California and San Diego, Carol?
So, I think one of the things that has come up in this legislative session at the state level is funding for intervention and prevention programs. Right now, we've got something called CalVIP, the California Violence Intervention Program, that funds a lot of the on the ground, boots on the ground kinds of programs, the Shafat outreach and the community wraparound types of organization. Kitchens for Good is another one. That funding is soon going to be drying up. And so there's a bill right now, it's AB 28, which is proposing a very small tax on firearms and ammunition that would supply a permanent source for that kind of funding. Because we look at the root causes of gun violence: poverty, inability to find work, nowhere to go, so other than going into a gang. So that's where we need to start the funding. So this bill, AB 28, is one that we're really supporting this year to get that funding to the boots on the ground folks that are preventing gun violence at the root root level.
Sure. Steve, do you have any things that you're thinking about in terms of, other than what Carol just talked about, in terms of state, local level? Like, what can we be doing that we're not doing now within the confines of, the Second Amendment?
Well, it's interesting you talk about the Second Amendment. I know we'll talk about that later.
We'll get to that. Mm-hmm.
But I think the most important thing is our ability to get information about how to act to more people, so that everybody can begin to contribute in whatever way they can. We talk about what's going to happen next Saturday with the Wear Orange campaign. We're hopeful that it will reach national level, and it's in honor of a particular young child that was killed. And it's Wear Orange, and you'll see those of us who are gun violence prevention people wear this orange tag. And the more people we get to be aware of that, the more we're involved. Carol's action, especially at our local level to the state level, is critical. But what we need is an increase in the mass of people who are going to sign up and help.
Sure, absolutely. Now, I've been kind of dancing around this topic for a while, so let's talk about the national level. I mean, it's the case that some of the gun control laws that have been passed by different states have been struck down in the past because of the Second Amendment. It seems to be the case that that's sort of the ultimate barrier, right? I mean, because you can only do so much to where you sort of run into this wall of the Constitution says, that there is this right to bear arms. And of course, that's open to interpretation given the language of the Second Amendment. But I mean, for both of you as gun violence prevention activists, do you sort of see this as an issue of, the Second Amendment is an obstacle that eventually needs to be removed to some extent? Or is it something where there's enough meaningful change that we can undertake without changing the Second Amendment and getting to that point? Like how does that play into what organizations like yours are trying to accomplish? Because the federal level is important. We do want some kind of national legislation, but that sort of seems to be the obstacle. So how do we dance around that?
Yeah. Well, I think your word dance is a good one because we are dancing around it. I don't ever see a day in my lifetime when the Second Amendment will go away. So we do have to find ways to work within the limits of the Second Amendment. The problem that's been happening is, just as you said, interpretation. And right now it has been interpreted so loosely that it's really advocating for guns everywhere. And I think that's the danger. So somewhere along the way, we have to kind of pull people back from this idea that, yes, it's okay to carry a weapon of war on the streets. It's not okay. But I've got my Second Amendment rights. Well, this is the problem that we have right now, that, yes, you have a right to bear arms, so it says, but let's be sensible about it. And I think that's where we've lost it. We've got lost along the way. I think the common sense about having weapons of war on every street corner, fortunately not in California, but in other states, it absolutely doesn't make sense. And it's that easy availability of them too that we need to pull back on.
If I could, the Anton Scalia watershed moment when the Supreme Court ruled that the District of Washington, D.C. District, I think, was that allowed an individual officer to carry a second weapon and to keep it in his home. And what they did was they used, they changed the law. But in that law, Anton Scalia clearly states in the rest of this ruling that he has, so he struck down the law that says, hey, this police officer should be allowed to carry the second weapon and keep it in his house. What Anton Scalia also said in there was that this law, this ruling, does not in any way interfere with our ability to legislate and to control the use of weapons in any case. We don't allow tanks on the street. We don't allow. So he clearly has stated that we have the right and the responsibility to legislate. What's happened is that our legislatures have now ignored that kind of codicil and said, okay, it's okay to walk around the streets. We have the legal system that has done this and is open carry. So we now have the other side of the constitutional law that is talking about the right to freedom of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. How can we attack that? So that, to me, the idea that we can't legislate is incorrect, that we should have the right to legislate. What we have is an interpretation by some legal scholars and everyone else that they have the right, but it's not in accordance with the constitutional law that Scalia has set up.
Yeah, and it's not clear by the language of the Second Amendment itself. I mean, if you think about it, like the Second Amendment says, right to bear arms, in accordance with a well-regulated militia. I mean, did the founding fathers anticipate back in the days of, muskets and bayonets, that we'd be, having these weapons that can kill so indiscriminately in our streets, and as you said, at every street corner. So, I mean, there's a whole question about how to interpret the Second Amendment. But regardless of that, the Supreme Court itself, the other problem is that the Supreme Court itself, as it's set up right now, seems unlikely to move in a progressive direction on that issue. And then the other problem that you also have is the legislature in the U.S. Senate and in the House, the gridlock there. So, I mean, is national legislation just not possible under these circumstances?
That's a good question, and I think you're right. Under the current situation we currently have right now, we're not going to get any. If we get an assault weapons ban, it will be a miracle. I hope it happens. I really, really do. At issue is the amount of money put forth by the gun industry overwhelmingly tries to influence that. And until we get the American public, and I'm sorry to beat this drum, the American public to say, stop. We have, 90% agree that we should have legislation about gun violence? Yeah. What we have a lack of follow-through by the legislature. So the population is behind the issue.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that because it seems like, so there's the question of gun control, and people think of gun control different terms. There's banning all firearms, there's banning high-capacity assault magazines, weapons. There's things like, but then there's things like red flag laws. There's things like background checks that it seems like the majority of Americans actually support. Things that are less controversial but still could have a substantial impact. Carol, talk about what are some of these things that at the national and state level are realistic that we could actually accomplish with bipartisan support, such as red flag laws and background checks. Can you sort of explain those concepts to people who might not be familiar?
Right. So right now at the federal level, we do have a background check system, but it's outdated and it needs to be updated. So the current background check system, which was actually passed with Jim Brady and the Brady organization's efforts, that went into effect before we had internet sales, and it also left a giant loophole with gun shows. So at that time, you could still buy a gun at a gun show with no background check, and that is still the case in many states, not in California. And then, of course, internet sales. So again, in California, a person buying a gun online does need to pick it up from a federally licensed gun dealer. That's not the case in many other states. So those are loopholes that need to be closed at the national level. And then the red flag laws that you mentioned, I think, even the gun, I want to call them the gun nuts, and that's being a little derogatory,
that's okay.
can support red flag laws because many of the NRA affiliates will say, oh, it's a mental health problem. Well, okay, then we need red flag laws for people who are in crisis to allow family members, law enforcement, workplace colleagues to report this person's in crisis. I know he or she has a gun, and get that gun out of the hands of that person on a temporary basis until the person in crisis gets some help, and then we can look at, okay, we can return your gun to you. So I think that's one that's very likely to move forward. Now, Biden's executive order has enabled the states, or has enabled the federal government to provide states with funding for 2 states who are pushing red flag laws. So that's a step in the right direction. So it's kind of a carrot. So, okay, you enforce red flag laws in your state, and we will provide funding for that enforcement and to make that happen. So I feel more confident with that than the background check, although you cannot, it's so nonsensical to me that you can buy a gun without a background check. There we are. That is where we are.
Hey there, San Diego. If you're on the hunt for a way to enhance your health, I have a great recommendation for you. Dorado Nutrition is a company that's all about helping people live their best lives through top-notch American-made supplements. Their expert team has crafted products to support a variety of health needs, from weight management to muscle building and more. And with ingredients like Vidosia agrestis and Tongkat Ali, praised by a well-known neurobiologist seen on the Joe Rogan podcast, these supplements could be just what you need to reach your health goals. And for a limited time, you can get 25% off your purchase by using promo code SD2023 at checkout. So if you're looking for a way to improve your health, Dorado Nutrition might just be the solution you need. Yeah, I mean, it seems like, why don't we, have some standard in the same way that we have, standards for driving. You have to get a license, you have to drive a certain number of hours, you have to go through the DMV. We don't do that with background checks. So red flag law is like this notion of, if someone's in a mental health crisis, or if someone has some sort of problematic history, or you don't want somebody who's maybe affiliated with an extremist group to have their hands on that kind of a weapon. It seems like something that people can get behind. It seems like something that a majority of people do actually support. Why do you think it hasn't happened yet, Steve?
Well, to tell you the truth, all of that's very true.
Yeah.
That we have seen evidence from the red flag law that was initiated here in San Diego, and its success. The problem is that we have a lack of follow through by the people in charge making the laws to actually make them do that.
Does that just go back again to the gun lobby and the power of the gun lobby, or what is it?
Yeah, exactly. There is an apathy, if you will, with there is this idea that any legislation that deals with guns is an antithesis to what we want, and it's just what they call the slippery slope. So we can't allow any legislation to come in, because that would allow them a loop in to get more. And there is this assumption that if we allow this, they're eventually going to get to the point where we want to take away their guns. It's really true that more than 90% of the gun owners in the United States are law-abiding, respectful, understanding, and responsible gun owners. So what we have here is we have an industry that really wants to try to say, no, we can't have you interfering with my money when I'm making money. So that's really the issue as far as I'm concerned. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, you did. Okay. And I do want to make a couple notes. One is that in both the shootings that I mentioned earlier, the Texas shootings, Allen, Texas, and Cleveland, Texas, both those shootings, the firearm was purchased legally. So,
that's correct.
And
correct.
Even with both of those people, to my knowledge, having previous history of mental health issues, of legal troubles. So it seems like pretty clear-cut cases where it's like you take people who have no business owning a gun. You say, hey, we have to wait till you're better, till you get some kind of help before we actually allow you to have a gun. But that sort of also ties into this conundrum, or this issue of the mental health crisis that we have in America, and how that affects our relationship with firearms. Now, some people sort of conflate these issues and say, we don't have a gun problem, we have a mental health problem. But what would you guys say to that? Because it seems to me like we have both. We both have a gun problem in this country, and we have a mental health problem in this country. But how are those two inappropriately conflated sometimes?
Well, I take the real parochial view, and here's my coffee, here's my cup. And that's the gun. If that gun just sits there, then nothing happens. I don't mean to say we'll take it away. If that gun just sits there, would somebody die? No. So it's the mental health. So the argument that comes up a lot of times is we do need to deal with mental health. That is an issue. We need to deal with mental health. We need to deal with suicide, all of these things. The problem is the tool, and I like to use that, the tool that's being used to cause that person in trauma to act is the gun. Mm-hmm. So we need to take and look at the issue. It's not the mental health, it's the weapon of choice. We have dealt with seatbelts in cars. We have dealt with nicotine in cigarettes. We have dealt with all these things through legislation. Why can't we deal with this?
Well, it's sort of right, because mental health is a problem, but you take a gun and you pair it with that situation, and you accelerate the violence that person is capable of.
That's right.
Right. So I mean, to me, it just seems sort of fallacious where you say we have a mental health problem, not a gun problem, because that person without a gun Sure, that you can do some damage, but you can't do nearly the kind of damage you can with an AR-15.
Oh yeah, there's all these things about you could get hit, you could kill somebody with a cigarette lighter, and you could do those. Look at what happens with a gun and all that issue.
Look what happened in Vegas. I mean, that's not possible without a gun.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Sorry,
okay.
Carol. Go ahead.
So just chiming in on the mental health. Every country in the world has people with mental health problems, but they don't have the carnage that we have in this country.
Yeah, they blame it on the violence on video games and things like that. Where they still have the same problems, but they don't have the gun deaths.
Yeah. Japan is one that comes to mind as video game king of the world. They don't have a gun problem. People do not get shot in Japan because you can't get your hands on a gun. So I think what Steve was saying, easy access, somebody with a mental health problem, and then easy access to a gun. Mm-hmm. And right now, we've got an estimated 400 million guns rattling around this country.
400 million? 400
million.
120 guns per citizen.
That's a lot of guns.
Is that ridiculous or
what?
That's
a lot of guns.
So, so we've got too many guns. And so when we've got too many guns, and then someone in a mental health crisis has easy access to that gun, or, a child wanting to, maybe that child is in a mental health crisis, because since COVID, we've had more and more problems with teenagers who are getting depressed and going into crisis. And then a parent who has not kept a gun stored, because we've got 75% of school shooters. I've kind of gone off topic here, but it is a little bit mental health, because I don't think a child with no mental health issue is going to commit a school shooting. So again, easy access to guns. A parent who has not locked up his or her gun and the child gets a hold of it, and goes into a school. So
if I can, there's one sort of nuanced point here. The background check system is as Carol has pointed out, clearly needs to be updated. But what happens is the federal background system doesn't include access to state and local information. What it does is it just has one sort of thing, and access to all these other things. The killings that happened at the church was an example. The person bought a gun
in Charleston.
Yeah. The person bought a gun, but there was a loophole in here in that he could have been caught if the background check had gone to the other system. They've got to be able to close that thing.
They have to share information.
Yes, they've got to be able to share information, and so they need to extend the amount of time that it takes to get a gun. If someone's really interested in getting a gun, it's like ordering a car. There's sometimes you can't wait. You have to wait 8 months to get a car because they're just not available. Well, guess what? You can wait 10 days or 2 weeks or whatever it is. So there's lots of other things. I'm sorry, Carol.
Well, just going on to that, then right now the federal law is a 3-day waiting period, and that was a problem with the Charleston shooter, because he didn't. The 3 days were up, and so the seller sold him the gun. California has a 10-day waiting period, and so what's wrong with 10 days?
Is the idea? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's all. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so the idea of the waiting period, extending the waiting period, because you have someone who's maybe in crisis, or somebody who's feeling homicidal, suicidal, whatever have you, and giving this person a gun without any sort of buffer period might accelerate the likelihood of that violence.
And that leads to suicide. The idea of suicide and all that stuff about having access to gun. Suicide is an immediate kind of response, and death by suicide is intentional and happens immediately. If the gun is there and available immediately, that's the way the tool can be used. Mm-hmm. That's the way that tool can be used.
Without giving that person time to...
That's right. But if the gun is not there, they go, okay, well, what else? Okay, so that's giving them time. So it's really clear that we can help alleviate some of the issue with suicide, gun suicide, by doing that.
And I do want to talk about gun suicides in a minute,
Sure.
but one thing is, and I should have started off with this, but the thing is that a lot of the conversation around guns, people say, if you take away the gun, people will still kill each other. There will still be other ways, but I want to really emphasize how uniquely American this problem is. I mean, among large developed nations, I was doing a little digging before this podcast episode, America has the highest rate of firearm homicides per 100,000 people in the world. It's since 2014, we've been about around 40,000 deaths a year from gun violence, which that's a lot. I mean, since 33, there was about 330 people who get shot every day, in America, which is, again, the most among large developed nations. Yeah. And there's been it's only getting worse. There's been a 23% increase in gun violence since 2019, which seems pretty substantial to me. So, I mean, I just, reading out these statistics, it's like we have a unique issue here. It's not like in other countries, Europe, Australia, places where they've taken away the guns, it's not like these mass homicides have continued. Actually, they've gone down. If you look at Australia, when they took away guns, homicides went down. Yeah. Mass killings like that went down. So it's not like if you take away the gun, people are going to be able to do the same thing with a knife or with poison or whatever. It's the gun, as you said, is the problem. It's a unique problem.
It's the gun.
And I wanted to touch on something which is, which we haven't even got to yet, which is the psychological aspect of this and the cultural aspect of this, because this seems to be a uniquely, again, American cultural issue, the problem of gun violence. And I'm wondering, how are we getting to the point now where people are growing up, children are growing up, sort of with this being a daily occurrence, with this being a regular occurrence, what that does to the psychology of people, that we have this culture of gun violence, what that does to the children, to people in their developmental stages. Let's have that conversation. And Carol, for you, what do you think is the long-term effect of that?
Well, we don't know what it's going to be, but it's not going to be good.
Yeah.
And there's more and more research into children who have been affected by gun violence. John Woodrow Cox, in his book, Children Under the Gun, he digs really deeply into two children who've experienced gun violence and how their lives have been totally destroyed. They don't know how to function in school, and they aren't getting the support services that they really do need. And that has been the case also. I'm thinking now of Uvalde because that's been very much in the news this week since it's the 1-year marking point. And so I've been hearing a lot about the students there who, right after the event, social services came in and they got a lot of mental health support, and then they went away. And so, you're healed now after 2 weeks of mental health help. And no, it does. That's 2 weeks is nothing like enough. They need years of support to get them through that sort of counseling support to get them through that kind of a challenge. And I talked to one of our coalition members who suffered. Well, she was shot. Her husband was killed, and a year later, her brother was killed. And she talks about the depression that she went into, the counseling that she needed to get through that. And this is an adult. So put that down a generation to a 10-year-old, which is the age of the children at Uvalde. And will they ever come through that? We don't know the answers because this is something new that's been happening. So we don't know. We do know the children, young people from Parkland, for example, who have become strong activists.
David Oggs, right?
March for Our Lives, yeah. And so they have become activists as a result of what they went through. But you talk to any of them, and they say the same. We need counseling. It doesn't go away.
Yeah, and I think there's another side of this, which is, obviously, the victims themselves of mass shootings, the survivors are horribly traumatized. But then there's also, even if you're not, a victim, just living in constant fear of a mass shooting. I mean, what that does for children, in their classrooms, having to go through these drills of, preparing for a worst case scenario, and seeing this in the media, seeing these graphic things unfold in live time. I mean, Steve, what is sort of that do to the psychology, you think, of a child, of a young adult, like people who are sort of growing up living in this constant threat of, I don't know if when I walk into a public place, if it's going to be safe. Like, what is that doing to us?
I look at this as having three kinds of areas that we should be concerned with. Imagine that you're in the classroom at Sandy Hook and one of your classmates is killed, and what is your long-term consequence? Is that a PTSD event for you? What are you going to be like when you get to be 12, 18? They're now going to be 16, 17-year-olds. So those are the people who were directly involved in that. That is Afghanistan. That's Iraq. That's those kids were there and they've seen that. They know what the look of death is. Then we have the people like you and I who may be associated with, we knew someone who was there, whether they're at the Pulse nightclub or whether they're in Thousand Oaks or whatever. But do we hear a backfire from a car? Do we react to all that stuff? So we have those two groups of people. And then we have the third group, and that's the most interesting, in that at a high school, we have a drill, and it's called a lockdown drill. We used to have fire drills. We go, oh, good, we'll just go out to the parking lot, and we'll stand there. No, you can't do that. You've got to go and cover in place. We now have an industry which is saying we want to be able to have doors that somebody can't get into. We want to build safe rooms in our schools. This is nuts. We are totally crazy. So what we now have, and I've had conversations with students, and they're elementary school kids, and they go, I don't know, I want to go to school today because they're going to have a drill, or they're going to have a shooter drill. And they ask their moms and dad, do I have to go? So we now have a culture of fear being built up. First with that PTSD, clearly. Secondly, with the people like you and I, are we looking around scared? And third, we are building this mistrust in our youth.
Sure. Sorry, Carol.
Well, I wanted to build a little bit on that, on the idea of mistrust, because our country is divided on so many levels, but one of those levels is on the mistrust around guns. And so we, on the gun violence prevention side, are saying, let's do something about the guns. People on the other side of the issue are saying, let's make schools into prisons and let's arm teachers. And is that what we really want? So we've got this two ways of looking at the problem. Okay, we address the problem with more guns, or we address the problem with gun safety laws and removing assault weapons from our streets.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think we'd be remiss in our time here if we didn't address the most deadly form of gun violence, which is suicides. And the fact is that Pew Research did results for 2021 showing there were about 48,000 deaths, give or take, from gun violence. We've talked about mass shootings, we mentioned gang violence, but over half of these were suicides,
right?
Which I know we've touched on, but I want to get into that a bit. So as far as Steve, can you talk about just when it comes to suicide? I mean, obviously, suicide is not an American thing. It's suicide is a human thing, unfortunately. But it seems like in this country we have more of it, and it's getting worse. And it seems as though guns sort of accelerate the rate of suicides and the likelihood of suicide. So for people who just talk about the importance of that side of the issue when it comes to gun violence prevention. We focus on the mass shootings, we focus on the stuff that the media covers, but this issue of gun suicides, like talk about that and talk about what we can do about that.
There's a twofold kind of argument. Carol touched on part of it, and that is that we have access, especially access by people who are vulnerable, suicidal or whatever. Awareness by all of us. This is Mental Health Awareness Month, so we're trying to do a great deal of work with that and everything else. The issue really is, from my perspective, parochial as it is, access. Someone has got to be able to say, I have access to a gun and I'm going to kill myself. And we talk about and I've mentioned this before, the immediacy of the decision to end your life and having a gun there and then shooting yourself. It's real clear to me that we need to do a better job of identifying and outreach portions of how people can get help for mental illness. And they need to be in a position where we can keep guns away from some of these people. I don't know. Carol, do you have any other comment about that?
So, the red flag laws that we talked about earlier. So a person who looks as if he's in danger of committing suicide, we've got that ability to have the gun removed. But in San Diego County now, we have safe storage laws. So a gun owner is required to keep firearms locked up, and unless that firearm is in his or her immediate use. So that's helpful. Now, there is a building at the national level, Ethan's Law, that is proposing the same thing, that if you have a firearm, you must have it locked in a safe, secured with a trigger lock. I don't see it going anywhere in the immediate future at the national level, but see, San Diego is leading the way with that. The state of California also has safe storage, but it's not as extensive. It's simply saying that the firearm must be kept out of the reach of children. It doesn't specify exactly how. So San Diego County's gone a step further with that and saying, this is how. Keep it locked in a gun safe, secure it with a trigger lock, unless you actually have it in your hand. So I see that as one strong way to address the suicide issue, and also the theft issue, which we haven't touched on, because thousands of guns every year are stolen from cars and homes where they've just been sitting around.
Yeah, exactly.
And get into the wrong
The
hands.
issue of mental health and suicides, we are getting to the point now where we're beginning to ask ourselves, what can we do when someone is in a mental health crisis? What can we do to ensure that there's not a weapon around? What can we do to ensure that they're not going to act on this? That's, to me, is the answer. So we still have the same problem. We still have the same problem in that we still have a gun. Mm-hmm. So without the gun, safe carry, all the laws, everything else, locking them up. The overwhelming public reaction to all of these things that Carol and I have been talking about are totally supported by the American public. The question for me is, why aren't we doing anything? And I've beat my dead horse.
I want to get into that in a second, why nothing's happened. But before that, I wanted to make the point that, just to be clear, neither you, Steve, or you, Carol, neither you're saying that without the guns, suicides wouldn't happen. Like suicide, unfortunately, will still happen. But the thing is that in taking away the gun, you're taking away a form of immediate access that strengthens the likelihood of a given suicide in a given moment. Right. And so the argument here is not that, because people say, well, someone will just find another way. That's true in some cases, but there are cases where the immediacy and the availability of a gun accelerates that likelihood that that person will take their own life. So I just wanted to make that clear.
I totally agree.
And just that fact of having a gun locked up. It's your gun, it's locked up. I'm going to kill myself, I'm going to unlock that safe, and I'm going to kill myself. Well, it's those few minutes that, wow, do I really want to do this? So, whereas if the gun was just sitting on the table, it would more likely happen.
Sure. I think you got a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that we have to talk about. Well, we already talked about the national level, but when we're talking about the fact that we keep coming back to this issue of, there's only so much we can do. Americans support red flag laws, support background checks on the whole. I think the question is just like, nothing's happening. Why is nothing happening? We talked about the gun lobby, we talked about the NRA, but what my question is this: what do you, the two of you, and your work and what you're seeing in terms of the political side of this, like, what do you think it's realistically going to take to turn a new leaf on this? Because as we talked about, the Supreme Court, the way that it's constructed now, seems unlikely to repudiate the past interpretations of the Second Amendment as it applies to state and federal legislation. And then you have a Congress that is divided to the point where the votes needed to pass overwhelming gun violence legislation seems not impossible, but extremely unlikely. What do you think it's going to take to turn the leaf over?
I think the work that Carol and San Diego for Gun Violence Prevention needs to be totally supported. And that means that the more voices we bring to this, the better off we are. Every time we show up at a table, every time we show up at a march, every time we do this, the more voices we have, the more likely that we're going to eventually get to my tipping point where something's going to happen. I've told Carol this. I'm not optimistic that at the federal level we're going to see any change.
Yeah,
we get a lot of posturing. We get a lot of my hearts and my prayers and all that stuff. That's bullshit.
Yeah.
But all of that stuff happens. But until we get to the point where someone who is in position, I thought that when Steve Scalise was shot, that we may have a change in his attitude. But here's a guy who was shot in a public event, and he says, "Oh, we got to have guns." And this is nuts.
Yeah.
This is totally nuts. So to answer your question, I think that the more voices we bring, the better off we're going to be. Here in San Diego, Carol and her group and what we try to do with moms and everybody else needs to be emphasized.
Sure. I want to propose something that we were talking about before the podcast episode, which is this idea of, and this is going to get graphic, but the fact is that when these shootings take place, it's horrible. It's especially the schoolroom shootings. I haven't seen the images, but apparently there are images from Uvalde, from some of the other shootings. If you dig deep enough, like, are we at a point now where it might actually, unfortunately, take a public display of what's actually happening, like what these things look like, to stir up enough outrage to actually impact things at the federal level? Like, is that sort of the next step for gun violence prevention? And it's a moral conundrum, right? Because you have victims, you have people, especially when it's a child who's killed. There's a moral conundrum of whether to show that to the world. But are we reaching a point now where that might be the only way to spur action from legislators?
It's interesting. We are thinking about this, that we had a change in Vietnam because we got bored of TV, and it got to be in your living room. So I don't know, Carol, what do you think?
Yeah, my personal view is, yes, we need to show the carnage. Of course, with the permission of
the consent,
survivors. And I'm thinking about that because I recently went to a photographic exhibition, actually in Croatia, but they were showing photographs of what's been happening in Ukraine. And do we ever see those in the press here?
No.
No. And I think that we do need to see those pictures. And I think we're going to, your original question was how down do we have to go? We're still going down, but I feel like everything that goes down eventually does rise up again. So we're on a very fast downward spiral of gun deaths in this country. So somewhere along the way, and whether it's through showing the actual carnage or whether it's through people waking up that this has got to stop, things do eventually have to change. And so locally, San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention, but there are also dozens of other gun violence prevention groups working across the country. When I first started out, it was Brady. And now we've got Giffords, we've got Guns Down America, we've got Moms Demand Action, and the list can go on. Little local groups as well, Grandmothers Against Gun Violence. And, so people are becoming increasingly aware. And so I have to just feel hopeful that the pendulum is going to swing. It's not going to swing fast enough from my point of view, but hopefully it will.
For the record, I think we ought to show the pictures.
Yeah. Well, I do want to mention that, with a lot of, the civil rights movement, that was well documented. Some of, the imagery of protesters being, beaten or harassed by authorities. As you mentioned Vietnam, the imagery from the Vietnam War and how that inspired the anti-war movement. So there is a precedent for imagery actually being a catalyst for change.
When they walk across the Pettus Bridge, and the police were clubbing people going back across, everybody goes, "No, we can't do this. This is So maybe you're wrong.
That might be what it takes. Now, I want to end with this thought, which is for somebody listening to this who might say, that's great the work you guys are doing, but we live in a country and a society where where things seem very bleak, things seem very hopeless on this particular issue because of the intractability at the federal level. And so there might be this thought of, this is only going to get worse. Like this is not going to get better anytime soon. Sort of ending on an optimistic note, like what can we be doing as individuals to make a difference on this issue? Because it's one of those problems that's so big, it seems like I just can't do anything about it. When we talk about things like climate change, gun violence, the opioid epidemic in America, like huge problems like that seem just like I can, as an individual, have no power. Like what would you sort of say to that?
This is interesting because I will call her every once in a while and say, "Oh, I'm so down. I need you to build me back up." But I'll let Carol do this because she is the reason that I continue.
Well, the whole thing is everybody can do something. And number one, educate yourself. Number two, join a gun violence prevention organization. San Diego, here we are, San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention, and we have a website, sandiegansforgunviolenceprevention.org.
I'm sorry, what was that website again?
sdforgbp.org. So you can find us. And then, okay, so what do you want to do? We send out calls to action, and it may be, call your local legislator, your state legislator, your federal legislator on a certain bill. Simple, easy call to action. It may be, can you join us to pass out information in an area in San Diego that's being adversely affected by gun violence? It may be simple as sign a petition. So all of those things, small and large, make a difference. And most of all, with the next election coming up, make sure that the legislator that you are voting for supports gun safety.
I think that paying attention is really important. For example, this coming week, Wednesday, the San Diego County Supervisor, Tara Lawson-Reamer, is going to have a presentation on Wednesday. Saturday, beginning then, and then on Saturday, SD for GVP and the local moms are going to have separate kind of support efforts to talk about Wear Orange. To pay attention, listen, and figure out, don't be afraid to look and ask, what can I do? There are tons and tons of things that people can do that only take a few minutes to do.
And I think it's also important to note that, like, this isn't an either or. Like, when people talk about, it's a mental health issue, like, there are multiple issues at play here. It's not like it's only the gun. I mean, it is the gun, right, but there's also the mental health component. There's also a cultural component. And this is me just kind of monologuing here, but it seems as though there's sort of, unfortunately, I've had the experience of reading some of the manifestos of some of these people who commit these acts, and it seems as though what I'm getting, and from when I'm talking to the activists such as yourself on both sides of the issue, that there's this deep-rooted contempt for human life in a lot of these people that seems sort of culturally embedded in our country because, again, it's not, homicide is not a uniquely American thing, but at the level that we're seeing gun violence and mass shootings, it's unprecedented. So it seems as though there is a mental health issue. There is a sort of this cultural contempt for human life that is impacting these shooters, and you can see it in the way that they write, all the way from the Columbine shooters to the present. You can see this. We also see extremism. We see white supremacists. We see terrorists. We see people do these things for a lot of different reasons. But I just want to emphasize that by no means is it one thing. This is a multifaceted issue. But where we need to start, it seems, sort of the argument I'm hearing here, is we need to start by limiting the immediacy of access to people who have mental health problems, who have, whatever history of background issues, who don't respect human life. We need to limit the access to guns, and that's step one. And then we can also be tackling these other issues. So I just wanted to go ahead, Steve.
No. I think your summation is absolutely perfect.
Carol, any final thoughts or?
No, I just thank you for having us.
You are adding the voice so that when we get to that tipping point, we're going to come back to you and say thank you for being that tipping point.
We're almost built in a day.
And I want to emphasize that the vast majority of gun owners are honest, hardworking
people.
They're good people. They want to. If you ask them, do you want gun deaths? And they would say no, absolutely not. There was a congressman in Alabama who said the consequence of having of dead gun deaths is we have this right to own a gun. And I go, this is nuts. So thank you very much for what you're doing.
Well, thank you for coming on, both of you. I mean, really, the thing is that it does have to start with awareness. It does start to have the education. Right. So that's why we're here. But I really respect the fact that you're both on the front lines of this. It's not easy, and as you said, I can't imagine how discouraging it can be some days to do this work and to not see the immediate change that we all want, or that the majority of us want. That how discouraging that is. So. I hope that both of you feel sort of the support of people who might be watching the show, people who are tuning in, people who are listening, that there are a lot of people who are rooting for you, who are cheering for you, and who are on your team. So
that's really good. Thank you very much. That really means a lot.
But thank you both for coming on today, and I appreciate your time.
Okay.
That's a wrap, Sean.
This has been another recorded episode of Stay Classy San Diego with your host, Steve Wire. Thanks again to our sponsors, MaxLux Media, maxluxmedia.com, and Dorado Nutrition at doradonutrition.com. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning into the show. See you next time. Stay classy, San Diego.